The conflict between Israel and Iran didn't just erupt in our time. It was written thousands of years ago. Before there were bombs, United Nations resolutions, or nuclear programs, the Bible warned of a clash between a chosen nation, Israel, and powers standing outside God's covenant. Among them, Persia, today's Iran, emerges not merely as a political adversary, but as a prophetic figure in a divine plan stretching from the days of Abraham to the end of the world. When Iran chants, "Wipe Israel off the map," they are not just waging war against a nation. They are challenging an unbreakable covenant. And the Bible itself, from Genesis to Ezekiel, foretold this conflict with a precision that makes the world today tremble. This is not just history, it is a warning. The conflict between Israel and Iran, known in the Bible as Persia, is not a story that began with today's news headlines. To understand why these two nations stand on opposing sides, we must travel back in time to a moment that shaped the destiny not only of these two peoples, but of the entire world. What if I told you that the seeds of this conflict were sown by a father and his two sons, thousands of years ago? The story begins with Abraham, a man chosen by God to become the father of a great nation, a nation bearing a divine covenant. In Genesis chapter 12, God called Abraham, then known as Abram, to leave his homeland for a land he would show him. God promised, "I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you," Genesis 12:2. But this promise was not merely about numerous descendants. It was about a sacred covenant, a unique relationship between God and his people. Yet the path to this promise was far from easy. Abraham and his wife Sarah were old and childless. In desperation and under the pressures of their time, Sarah suggested that Abraham take Hagar, an Egyptian servant, to bear a child. Thus Ishmael was born, Abraham's firstborn son, a child deeply loved but not the child of the promise. When Isaac, Sarah's son, was born according to God's promise, tension arose. In Genesis 17:19-21, God declared clearly, "Yes, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly, and he will become a great nation." Two sons, two destinies. Isaac carried God's covenant, becoming the ancestor of the Israelites. Ishmael, though blessed, stood outside the covenant, and his descendants formed many Arab tribes, some of which are linked to modern Islamic nations, including those with complex ties to today's Iran. But why could a family moment lead to a global conflict? The answer lies in the nature of the covenant. God's covenant with Isaac was not just a promise of land or offspring, but a plan of redemption for all humanity. From Isaac's line came Israel, and through Israel, the Messiah, Jesus, would come. Meanwhile, Ishmael, though blessed by God, represented a different lineage, a great nation but one without the covenant's responsibility. This division was not merely about bloodlines but about spiritual purpose, creating a tension that has echoed through centuries. A tension we see resonating in today's headlines about Israel and Iran. Consider this. Even in Genesis 16:12, God described Ishmael saying, "He will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him." This prophecy was not a curse, but a description of a lineage that would live in opposition, sometimes in conflict, with those around them. And when we look at history, we see Ishmael's descendants, the Arab tribes, frequently clashing with Israel, from ancient times to modern conflicts. But the story doesn't end there, for Iran or Persia is not solely tied to Ishmael but has another origin, one also recorded in the Bible. To understand Iran's role in this story, we must leave Abraham's tent and step into a broader world where nations arose from ancient lineages. In Genesis 10, known as the Table of Nations, we are introduced to the descendants of Noah after the Great Flood. Among Noah's sons was Japheth, and one of Japheth's sons was Madai. The Bible records, the sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. Genesis 10:2. Madai was the ancestor of the Medes, an ancient people who would unite with the Persians to form one of history's mightiest empires, the Medo-Persian Empire, the root of modern Iran. How could a people emerging from an obscure name in the Bible become a central figure in God's plan? The Medes, initially a tribe in what is now northwestern Iran, grew into a powerful force. By the 7th century BC, they allied with the Persians, a neighboring people, to overthrow mighty empires like Assyria and Babylon. The result was the Medo-Persian Empire, stretching from India to Ethiopia, ruling much of the ancient world. But what is astonishing is not just their military might, but their role in God's story. In the Bible, Persia is not a mere footnote. It is a key player in God's prophetic timeline, a nation used by God to shape the destiny of His people. From kings like Cyrus the Great, who freed the Jews, to stories like Esther, where Persia served as a stage for redemption, this empire played an irreplaceable role. But what made Persia unique? Unlike Israel, Persia did not carry God's covenant. They were a pagan nation, worshiping gods like Ahura Mazda and Zoroastrianism. Yet in His sovereign power, God chose to use them to fulfill His purposes. Imagine this, a mighty empire with splendid palaces and an invincible army, becoming a tool in the hands of Israel's God. This reminds us that God's plan is not limited by geography, culture, or religion. He can use anyone, any nation, to write His story of redemption. But Persia's story is not just one of glory, it is also one of tension, a contrast with Israel, a nation bearing a covenant that Persia, though blessed, could never possess. And this tension leads us to a king, a man named in the Bible before he was even born. If any figure proves the wonder of God's plan, it is Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who altered the course of Israel's history. Why would God choose a pagan king, one who did not know Him, to become the liberator of His people? The answer lies in the pages of Isaiah, where God, through His prophet, did the unthinkable. He named a king more than 150 years before his birth. In Isaiah 44:28, God declares, "I say of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will accomplish all that I desire. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid." And in Isaiah 45:1, God calls Cyrus His anointed, a rare title typically reserved for Israel's prophets or kings. Pause for a moment to reflect. Cyrus was not an Israelite, not a follower of God, but a pagan king ruling an empire that worshipped other gods. Yet God chose him for a sacred mission. The story begins in 586 BC, when Jerusalem was destroyed by Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar. The Lord's temple was burned, the people of Judah were exiled, and it seemed God's covenant had shattered. But through the prophet Jeremiah, God promised that after 70 years, His people would return, Jeremiah 29:10. And the one who fulfilled this promise was Cyrus. In 539 BC, Cyrus conquered Babylon, toppling the empire that had held the Jews captive. Instead of furthering their oppression, he issued a historic decree, recorded in Ezra 1:2-4. "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and He has appointed me to build a temple for Him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of His people among you, may their God be with them, let them go up to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple." This decree was not just a political act. It was a prophetic miracle, proof that God controls history. Through Cyrus, the Jews returned to their homeland, the temple was rebuilt, and Israel's center of worship was restored. Persia, an empire outside God's covenant, became an instrument of redemption. But this raises a profound question. Why would a nation that once liberated Israel later become its enemy? The answer lies in the nature of history and prophecy. What God uses today may be tested tomorrow. Cyrus was more than a king. He was a sign of God's power, a reminder that God can use anyone to fulfill His purposes. But Persia's role did not end there. Behind Cyrus's glory lies a shadow, a hint that the relationship between Persia and Israel was not only about liberation, but also about a future confrontation. To understand this, we must look at the spiritual tension between these two nations. As we consider the stories of Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, and Persia, a larger picture emerges. Israel and Persia are not just two nations with separate histories. They are two lineages seen by God, woven into His plan, but with distinct roles. Could the seeds of today's conflict between Israel and Iran have been sown in the earliest days of biblical history? To answer, we must examine the nature of the covenant and how it shapes the relationship between nations. Israel, through Isaac, was chosen to bear God's covenant. In Genesis 17:7, God declares, "I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you." This covenant was not just a promise of land or offspring, but a spiritual mission. Through Israel, all nations would be blessed, Genesis 12:3. Yet this also placed Israel in a unique position, one often challenged by surrounding nations. Meanwhile, Ishmael and Madai, the ancestor of Persia, were blessed but did not carry the covenant. Ishmael became the father of Arab tribes, some of which have historical ties to the land now called Iran. Madai, through the Medes, led to the rise of Persia, a powerful nation but one outside God's covenant. This division created a spiritual tension, a contrast between the chosen people and other nations, which, though blessed, yearn for a place in God's story. Consider this. Throughout biblical history, Israel faced neighboring nations, from the Philistines to the Amalekites, from the Moabites to the Edomites. But Persia, with its unique role, was more than a neighbor. It was a test, a force used by God to both redeem and challenge his people. In Cyrus's story, we see redemption. But in the Bible's later pages, we will see Persia become a stage for confrontation, as in the story of Esther, and ultimately, in Ezekiel 38's prophecy, an enemy of Israel in the latter days. What if this tension is not just history, but part of a divine architecture leading to a final war? As we look at today's headlines, Iran threatening Israel, funding terrorism, pursuing nuclear ambitions, we cannot help but wonder if we are witnessing the continuation of a story that began with Abraham. Israel and Persia, Isaac and Madai, the covenant and those outside it. This is not just a geopolitical tale. It is a war written in the Bible's earliest pages, a war we are watching unfold before our eyes. Imagine you're a young woman living in a foreign empire, where your identity must be hidden to save your life. You have no power, no army, yet the fate of an entire nation rests in your hands. How could an unknown woman like this change the destiny of her people within the heart of a mighty empire like Persia? This is the story of Esther, a tale not only of courage, but also of how God uses the humble to accomplish his grand plans. It's also a warning that even in the days when Persia was an ally of Israel, the seeds of confrontation were already present. The story unfolds during the reign of King Xerxes I, known in the Bible as Ahasuerus, who ruled the Persian Empire in the 5th century BC. His kingdom stretched from India to Ethiopia, a magnificent empire with opulent palaces and absolute power. But within the courts of this empire, a sinister plot was brewing. Haman, a high-ranking official, harbored deep hatred for the Jewish people. Why? Because Mordecai, a Jew, refused to bow to Haman out of loyalty to God. In his fury, Haman didn't just target Mordecai, he persuaded the king to issue a decree. On a chosen day, all Jews in the empire, men, women, children, and the elderly, would be annihilated with no one spared. This decree, sealed with the king's ring, was irrevocable under Persian law. The situation seemed hopeless, but God had prepared someone for this very moment. Esther, a Jewish orphan raised by Mordecai, who, through a series of miraculous events, had become Xerxes' queen. No one at court knew she was Jewish. When Mordecai learned of Haman's plot, he sent a message to Esther with the famous words from Esther 4:14. "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" These words were not just a call to action, but a reminder that God always has a plan, even in the darkest hours. With courage and faith, Esther risked her life, approaching the king uninvited, an act that could lead to death. She revealed her Jewish identity, exposed Haman's plot, and pleaded for her people's salvation. The result? The king was enraged, ordering Haman to be hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. A new decree was issued, allowing the Jews to defend themselves. The day meant for their destruction became a day of victory, as the Jews defeated their enemies and were preserved. The festival of Purim, still celebrated today, stands as a testament to this divine deliverance. But Esther's story is not just about triumph. It's a reminder that even when Persia was a place God used to save Israel, it was also a place of potential threat. Haman was not a random enemy. His hatred reflected a spirit opposed to God's chosen people, a spirit that would reappear in history and notably in modern Iran. What if Esther's story is not just history, but a shadow of what's to come? Persia, once a stage for redemption, also showed that hostility toward Israel could arise at any moment, even within an ally. From Esther's time, the Persian Empire continued to shine as one of the ancient world's most powerful kingdoms. But history does not stand still, and what was once glorious eventually fades. What transformed a nation that once liberated Israel into one that vows to wipe Israel off the map? To answer, we must journey through centuries, from the fall of ancient Persia to the rise of modern Iran, a path that reveals how a nation's role in God's story can shift. After Xerxes, the Persian Empire gradually weakened. By the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great of Greece conquered Persia, ending the glorious Achaemenid dynasty. In the centuries that followed, the land fell to other empires. First the Greek Seleucids, then the Parthians, and later the Sassanid Empire, also of Persian origin. In the 7th century, Arab-Muslim conquest brought Islam to the region, transforming Persia into part of the Islamic world. Over time, it was ruled by Mongol, Ottoman, and local dynasties. Each change reshaped the land, but the spirit of Persia, its pride, strength, and thirst for power, endured. A pivotal turning point came in 1979, when the Islamic Revolution overthrew the monarchy of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a Western ally. Under the leadership of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, Iran became an Islamic republic, a theocratic regime rooted in Shiite Islam. This transformation was not merely political. It marked Persia's rebirth as a spiritual force, a nation not only seeking power, but carrying a religious mission, to oppose Israel, which they call the Little Satan. Today, Iran does not merely oppose Israel's policies. They deny Israel's right to exist, viewing it as an alien entity on Islamic land. This stance is enshrined in Iran's constitution and echoed in the speeches of its leaders, who chant death to Israel. Iran funnels billions of dollars to terrorist groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and militias in Syria and Iraq. They supply weapons, training, and strategies to encircle Israel from multiple fronts. Iran's nuclear ambitions, suspected by the world to aim for nuclear weapons, heighten fears that they seek not just to threaten, but to annihilate Israel. But why does Iran focus on Israel with such intense hatred? The answer lies not only in politics or religion, but in a deeper transformation. Persia, once used by God to restore Israel, now stands in opposition, as if a different spirit has taken hold. And the Bible, as we will see, foresaw this shift, not just in history, but in prophecy. If you think the conflict between Israel and Iran is merely a modern issue, pause for a moment. Could Iran today be fulfilling a prophecy written 2,500 years ago? In Ezekiel chapter 38, one of the Bible's most enigmatic prophecies, we find a vision of a war in the latter days where a coalition of nations, including Persia, modern-day Iran, will attack Israel. This prophecy is not just a prediction, it's a warning that what we see today may be part of a greater divine plan. Ezekiel, a prophet living during Israel's exile in Babylon, was shown a vision by God. In Ezekiel 38, 1-5, God says, "Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets." Persia is named first in this coalition, a detail we cannot overlook. But who are Gog and Magog? Though scholars debate, many believe Magog refers to a region north of Israel, possibly linked to modern-day Russia or Central Asia. Cush and Put are often associated with Sudan, Ethiopia, or Libya. This is an international alliance, gathered with one goal, to attack Israel. The prophecy describes this attack as more than military. It carries spiritual significance. In Ezekiel 38, 10-11, God says Gog will devise an evil scheme, saying, "I will invade a land of unwalled villages, a peaceful and unsuspecting people." This suggests an Israel living in peace, unaware of the attack. But why does this coalition target Israel? Not just for land or resources, but because Israel is the symbol of God's covenant, a nation carrying his promise of redemption. This war, therefore, is not merely human. It is a challenge against God himself. When we look at Iran today, the signs of Ezekiel 38 seem to be emerging. Iran does not act alone. They build alliances with forces like Hezbollah, the Assad regime in Syria, and militias in Iraq. They supply weapons to Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, creating a ring around Israel from the north, south, and east. Iran's leaders frequently threaten to wipe Israel off the map, language that echoes the evil scheme in Ezekiel. Moreover, their nuclear ambitions, though masked by claims of peaceful energy, fuel fears that they are preparing for a greater confrontation. But Ezekiel 38 does not end with this coalition's victory. In Ezekiel 38:18-23, God declares, "My hot anger will be aroused. I will execute judgment with plague and bloodshed, with torrential rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur." This is not just a military conflict. It is divine intervention, a moment when God defends his covenant and shows the world that he is the Almighty. What if Iran's actions today are part of a setup leading to this moment? Ezekiel's prophecy is not just an ancient tale. It is a warning that we may be living in a time when the Bible's pages are coming to life. The conflict between Israel and Iran is not confined to battlefields or diplomatic halls. There is another war, invisible but far more powerful, raging behind the scenes. What if behind the missiles and politics lies an ancient force aiming to destroy God's covenant? The Bible pulls back this curtain, revealing that nations are shaped not only by human hands, but also by spiritual powers. In Daniel chapter 10, we find a remarkable story. Daniel, a prophet living under Persian rule, prayed and fasted to seek God's guidance. An angel was sent to him, but was delayed for 21 days by the prince of the Persian kingdom, Daniel 10:13. This was not a human king, but a spiritual entity, a demonic power behind the Persian Empire. Ultimately, the archangel Michael, one of the chief princes, intervened to allow the angel to reach Daniel. This story unveils a profound truth. Behind every empire, every conflict, invisible forces are at work. If there was a prince of Persia in Daniel's time, who stands behind Iran today? The Bible teaches that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, authorities, and powers of this dark world, Ephesians 6:12. Iran's hatred for Israel is not merely political or religious. It bears the mark of a spirit opposed to God's covenant, a spirit the Bible calls the spirit of the Antichrist, in 1 John 2:18. Dear children, this is the last hour. Many antichrists have come. This spirit does not only arise in the last days, it is already at work, manifesting in systems, ideologies, and even nations that oppose God's people. Israel is not just a nation, it is a testimony to God's faithfulness, a sign that his promises never fail. For spiritual powers, there is no greater threat than a covenant that stands firm. That is why Iran, with its threats and actions, targets not only Israel but God's very plan. But here's what the powers of darkness forget. Every attempt to destroy God's covenant will fail. In Genesis 12:3, God told Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse." This promise was not just for Abraham but for Israel, and it remains in force today. So what are we witnessing? Not just a geopolitical conflict, but a spiritual battle, where invisible powers manipulate nations to challenge God's purpose. Yet the Bible assures us that no matter how fiercely nations rage or how wicked their plans, God remains in control. And in what follows, we will see how Jerusalem, the heart of the covenant, becomes the ultimate target of this war. When we speak of the conflict between Israel and Iran, one name stands out, a place that transcends all definitions of geography or politics. Why does a small city become the target of nations in the heart of God's redemptive plan? Jerusalem, not just Israel's capital, not merely a holy site, but the heartbeat of prophecy where the eyes of history, present, and future converge. In the Bible, Jerusalem is more than a location. It is where God places his name, the center of his covenant, and the stage for the world's final events. Let's begin with a powerful declaration in 2 Chronicles 6:6, when King Solomon prayed at the temple's dedication. But now I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there, and I have chosen David to rule my people Israel. This is not merely a geographical statement. It is an affirmation that Jerusalem belongs to God, the place he chose to manifest his presence and power. From David's time, Jerusalem became a symbol of the relationship between God and his people, where the temple was built, worship was offered, and prophets received visions of the future. But Jerusalem's significance extends beyond Israel. It has been the target of nations, from ancient Babylon to Rome, from the Crusades of the Middle Ages to modern disputes. In Zechariah 12:2-3, God declares, "I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. On that day, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves." This prophecy reveals that Jerusalem is not just a city, but a spiritual challenge. Nations seek to control it, to seize it, but they will fail, for Jerusalem belongs not to man, but to God. At the heart of Jerusalem lies a special place, the Mount of Olives. In Zechariah 14:4, the prophet describes a climactic moment. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley. This is not symbolism, but a literal event. The Mount of Olives, where Jesus prayed before his crucifixion and ascended to heaven, Acts 1:11, will be where he returns to confront the nations gathered against Israel. This is why Jerusalem, and particularly the Mount of Olives, is central to every prophecy about the end times. Could today's headlines about conflicts in Jerusalem be signs that we are drawing closer to that moment? When Iran and its allies target Jerusalem, they are not merely aiming at a city, but at God's very plan. Jerusalem, therefore, is not just a geopolitical battlefield. It is a spiritual battleground, where the powers of the world clash with God's purpose. And as we see conflicts intensify, from Iran's threats to attacks by groups they support, we must ask, what if this is not just news, but the unfolding of a story written long ago? When we examine Iran's actions in the modern world, we cannot ignore a troubling pattern. Are today's headlines painting the picture of a war foretold long ago? Iran is not merely a nation with regional ambitions. They have positioned themselves as a leading force in a coalition against Israel, a coalition many believe aligns with the prophecy of Ezekiel 38 we've mentioned. To understand this, we must look at how Iran is acting today and how these actions reflect a deeper purpose. Iran, under its theocratic regime, has made hatred for Israel a core part of its ideology. Iran's leaders, from Ayatollah Khomeini to his successors, have called Israel the Little Satan and America the Great Satan, viewing Israel as an illegitimate entity that must be erased. In public speeches, they boldly declare their intent to liberate Jerusalem from Israeli control. But these are not empty words. Iran has invested billions of dollars in building a network of armed groups encircling Israel. Hezbollah, a militia in Lebanon, is equipped with missiles and trained by Iran to threaten Israel's northern border. Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, backed financially and with weapons by Iran, relentlessly attack Israel from the south. Militias in Syria and Iraq, also supported by Iran, form a strategic ring around Israel. Moreover, Iran's nuclear program is a global concern. Though Iran claims it is for peaceful purposes, many nations, including Israel and Western allies, suspect Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons. A nuclear-armed Iran would not only threaten Israel, but also shift the balance of power in the Middle East. Iran's leaders have not hidden their intentions. In 2015, a senior commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard declared that wiping Israel off the map is non-negotiable. These words are not mere provocation. They reflect a mission Iran sees as both political and religious, to seize Jerusalem and destroy Israel. But how does this relate to prophecy? In Ezekiel 38, the coalition against Israel is described as targeting a land of unwalled villages, a people living in peace. Today, Israel, though militarily strong, faces threats from multiple fronts, with Iran playing a central role in orchestrating these attacks. Iran-backed groups like Hezbollah possess tens of thousands of missiles capable of targeting major Israeli cities, including Jerusalem. When Iran speaks of liberating Jerusalem, they are not just aiming at a city, but at the symbol of God's covenant. Is this preparation for the coalition Ezekiel saw, one that will lead to a final confrontation? Iran's actions today seem to paint the picture of an ancient prophecy, where Jerusalem becomes the focal point of a war not only of men, but of heaven itself. Amid escalating conflict, as Jerusalem becomes a target and Iran leads a coalition against Israel, a critical question arises for those who believe in God. Will you be one who skims past the signs, or one who rises to shape the story of this era? The church, the body of Christ on earth, is not called to stand on the sidelines, scrolling through headlines or slumbering in comfort. We are called to be awake, to pray, and to recognize that what is happening is not just a geopolitical war, but part of a prophetic convergence. The Bible commands clearly in Psalm 122, verse 6, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you be secure." This call is not a suggestion, but a responsibility. Praying for Jerusalem is not just praying for a city. It is praying for the fulfillment of God's covenant, for the protection of his people, and for the day when the King returns. The church was born in Jerusalem when the Holy Spirit descended on Pentecost, Acts 2, 1-4. And it is in Jerusalem that prophecy will reach its climax when Jesus returns to the Mount of Olives to establish his kingdom. But the church's role does not stop at prayer. We are called to discern, to look beyond headlines and political analyses and recognize the spiritual significance of what is unfolding. In Matthew 24:42, Jesus warns, "Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come." Keeping watch is not just observing, it is living with readiness, with faith that every event, every conflict may be a step toward the fulfillment of prophecy. As Iran tightens its grip around Israel, as threats of war grow, the church must be the voice reminding the world that this is not chaos. It is convergence, where the Bible's pages come to life. The church is also called to bear witness. In Acts 1:8, Jesus told his disciples, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." These words were not just for the first disciples, but for every believer today. Bearing witness does not mean taking up arms or engaging in politics. It means living a life that reflects God's truth, sharing the gospel, and praying for his will to be done. Are you ready to rise in this season, or will you let yourself be lulled by the noise of the world? The church cannot be silent when the signs are clearer than ever. Though the conflict between Israel and Iran may fill the world with fear, though nations gather to oppose Jerusalem, one truth remains unshakable: God's covenant is unbreakable. When nations rage, why does the Bible say God in heaven merely laughs? In Psalm 2, verse 1-4, Scripture states, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed. The one enthroned in heaven laughs, the Lord scoffs at them." These words are a powerful reminder that no force, no coalition, no weapon can overthrow God's plan. In Ezekiel 38:18-23, God declares that when nations gather against Israel, my hot anger will be aroused. He will judge with plague and bloodshed, torrential rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur. This is not mere vengeance. It is divine justice, a moment when God shows the world that he is the Almighty. Iran, with all its ambitions and alliances, may believe it holds control, but the Bible makes clear, no nation can stand when it opposes God's purpose. And the climax of this story will unfold in Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. Zechariah 14:4 describes the moment of the Lord's return, when the Mount of Olives will be split in two. This is the day when every war will cease, every empire will fall, and only one king will stand, not elected, not overthrown, but worshipped by all creation. In Revelation 19:11-16, we see Jesus returning as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, leading heaven's armies to defeat God's enemies. Iran, Gog, or any other coalition will be powerless against this might. So what does this mean for us today? It means that no matter how the world trembles, no matter how frightening the headlines, we need not fear. God's covenant is sure, his promises are eternal, and his victory is inevitable. As we see Iran and its allies challenge Israel, as Jerusalem becomes the focus of global attention, We are not just watching news. We are witnessing the fulfillment of a story that began in the Bible's earliest pages, a story that will end with the return of the King. As we close this journey, one question echoes. Are you watching the signs of this era? The conflict between Israel and Iran is not merely a story of war or politics. It is part of a greater narrative, a story of God's unbreakable covenant, a city bearing his name, and the day when the King will return to the Mount of Olives. From ancient lineages to powerful prophecies, from Jerusalem to the role of the church, we see everything converging, as if the pages of the Bible are coming alive before our eyes. Are you ready to rise, pray, and bear witness in this season? Though the world may tremble, though nations rage, Psalm 2 reminds us that God in heaven laughs, for his victory is already assured. So don't just be a bystander. Be a participant, praying for the peace of Jerusalem and living with faith that God is writing the final chapter. If this video has opened your eyes to the prophetic hour we're living in, hit like, share, and subscribe to join us in exploring more stories from the Bible. May you find hope and strength in God's word, and we'll see you in the next video. God bless you.